Hello, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. We're going to continue today a series on the creation of assets. These are two-dimensional video assets that you can use for compositing in your projects, or also use for the placement as a billboard within a three-dimensional scene. We're going to work a little bit with particles today. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a particle system that we can then render out from OpenGL, and we'll set up maybe a couple of different manners by which we can render that out, and then we're going to take that render and we're going to use the render for further creation of additional assets. So we're going to start with kind of a simple particle system, and then we're going to expand that out from there. So let's get started here. We're going to go to the front view. We are in Blender version 2.77. This is the official release. This is not the PBR version. I did a tutorial on the PBR branch recently. We're not going to be dealing with that because we're just going to be dealing with OpenGL particles. So we can use the regular official version. I'm going to align the camera to view. We're going to bring the camera up on the Z-axis. A little bit, just so we can get kind of a ground plane perspective. We won't need the light, so we can get rid of that. We're not going to need this cube, so we can get rid of that as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a field of particles that is moving through the scene, and we're going to just try to emulate perhaps the essence of falling particles, maybe snow or ash or something like that. Let's set up a plane here. So we're going to put this plane in. We'll move it up on the Z-axis. We'll scale it up. And we'll scale it out on the X-axis. So we'll get a little bit of perspective in here. And then we're going to put a particle system on this plane. So we'll slide this window open up the particle settings, hit New. We'll just hit play, see what we get here. So we have some particles falling. We want the rate of falling to be quite a bit less. In fact, we don't really want there to be a rate of falling. When we have particles moving through space that are resisted by the air, they are moving by the force of the wind or the displacement that exists within the atmosphere. And gravity has less of a factor in the way that they move, other than that they move in the direction of gravity in general, even if they're caught up in some kind of a field of a wind or breeze to recycle back around. So let's just go down to the weight settings, and we're going to turn off the gravity entirely. So we'll just set that to 0. It won't really matter. And this brings up an important point, that we don't need to set up a scene that is physically accurate in order to create some kind of a visualization or simulation that appears to be physically accurate. Our goal in creating an effect is to get the desired effect, not to replicate all of the factors of reality. So we're looking for what looks like reality, not necessarily having to make it work like reality, so if that makes sense. So we don't need gravity, so let's get rid of the things we don't really need. I'm going to flip this plane here on the y-axis, so we'll rotate it on the y-axis 180 degrees. The normal is on this side of the plane, and as it was turned the other way, when we use our particle emission normal setting, it was particles were going the other way, and rather than having to use negative values, we'll just turn the plane over. So let's set this to 2 and see what we get here. If I play back, we can see that we have particles falling at a pretty good rate. I actually like that rate. Let's increase the lifetime. You can see that 50 frames gets us about a third of the way down. So let's increase the lifetime to about 200. It'll get us well past the view of the camera. And hopefully that's what we get. The particles should reach kind of the bottom end of the scene here before they disappear. You can see they're disappearing somewhere down here. So let's turn up. We're going to make maybe a 250 frame cycle here. Let's set the end frame, that's what I wanted, to 250 frames. So we have it at 250 frames. Let's see what this looks like. So this looks good. Let's figure out where the frame number is at when our particles reach the bottom edge. So I'm looking at the particles that are in the backmost part of the visualization here. It actually gets up to about 150 frames before they are down past the edge. So we're going to set our start to negative 150. This is going to spread out our 1,000 particles over the course of all 250 frames here. So now as we hit play, we can see these particles are now filling up the scene. Now we have a lot of wasted space here, so what I'm going to do is scale this in on the x-axis until the corner, the back corner, is just on the inside of our frame here. And let's see what that looks like. Let's get a few more particles inside of the visualization. And then let's also increase the amount of particles. Let's double it. We'll take it to 2,000. That's not right. Let's try that again. Sometimes you'll find this kind of thing happening in the particle system. If you have it on frame 1 and you change the setting, sometimes things won't update quite right. And you see that now we're stuck with this pre-cached keyframe, and you can see all kinds of strange things happening. So I find that when you put it in the kind of towards the center and then you update a setting, you tend to get better results. Another thing we can do is just jump up the seed one spot here and then go back to the beginning, and now you can see everything is corrected. So this is what we've got. That's pretty good. Let's add a few more settings. We're going to turn up the random emission. No, we don't want to change that. Sorry, the random emission down here for velocity to, we'll set that to 0.5. And again, I made the mistake of setting it at the beginning, but it's, you can see we have these artifacts now. Let's go to the middle and we'll go back to frame 0. Seed 0. There we go. So now we have kind of this interplay of these particles as if there's different portions of turbulence that are in there. Let's come down to the Brownian forces, and we'll set that up to 1. Now this gives it kind of a jittering force so that the particles will move in a different direction kind of midstream, and they're all independent agents in that. So let's go back to the beginning, see what that looks like. So you can see a little bit of a movement, pulsation in the way that they move. Let's see if we can change the type of particle here. We're going to try to generate the appearance of motion blur, so without having to actually create motion blur. So let's go to the type of particle. We're going to, instead of having halo, we're going to select this one that says line. So let's play this back. We can see what's going on here. So we have these particles that look like these lines, like long streaks. Now they're a little bit ridiculous. You see, if I go from, like, watch this particle here. If I go from one frame to the next, you can see it moves only a tiny bit of a tiny amount, but there's a really long trail behind it. So we're going to turn on this setting over here. It says speed. Multiply the line by speed. And then we're going to take the tail, and we're going to set the tail to a 0.03. See what that looks like. So let's set that up a little bit more, 0.05. Go frame by frame. So the idea is that we don't want the trail, if you watch this particle here, to go beyond the previous frame in distance. And that's about right about where it's at. So what this is doing is it's taking the speed of each particle, and that it is adding a tail to it based on its speed. So if some particles move faster than others, then the speed will change the tail to be a little bit different. Okay, so we have kind of this effect here. Let's get some variation in the speed of some of these particles. There's a few ways to do that. One quick way is to just add a secondary particle system. So we're going to leave this on at 2,000. We're not going to change the amount, but we're going to add another particle system. And for the second particle system, I'm going to select the settings for the first particle system. So now we have a duplicate. I'm going to click on this 2 over here to make it its own user. So it's borrowed all of the original settings from the first particle system, but now we can change those settings without affecting the first particle system. So let's just change the, we'll go to the middle here, and we'll change the seed to 1. So if we go back now, we should have 2 different particle systems with the same setting that are emitting particles in different locations. So you can see what that looks like. Now let's take the second one, and we're going to change the emitter normal velocity to 2.5. Now this will do a couple of things. One is that it'll make these particles move faster, but it also increase the tails because they're moving at a higher velocity. So these particles will move a little bit quicker than the other ones. We need to be able to see all these particles, so let's put a material on here. We're going to set our viewport to texture, and then we're going to open up our sidebar tab here. We're going to turn on GLSL, so we can use the GLSL rendering properties. Then we're going to take the plane, we're going to give it a material, and we're going to set the material to shadeless. We'll bump up the intensity, and we're going to set this all the way up to white. Now if we click on the camera, we can see just the particles in the scene. And now if we play this back, we can see that we have particles moving at 2 different rates of speed, like so. Let's see if we can get this to jumble up just a little bit. We're going to add a distortion field to this. Let's see if we can find it here. It might not be in this menu. Come down here to the add menu at the bottom. And force field, and we're going to select turbulence, and we'll move this up kind of into the middle, and let's just play back, see what the default settings look like. So there's a little bit of turbulence going on there. Let's go to the settings for this force field over here in the physics. Let's turn the power. Let's turn the noise up to 5. We'll turn the strength up to 2. We'll turn the flow up to 1. And yeah, let's see what that does. So you can see there's an awful lot of stuff going on here. Let's turn the strength down to 1, back to 1. We'll turn the flow back to 0.5. You get quite a bit of variation here. Let's turn the flow down to only 0.1. So we see some of these particles are being picked up and moving around. I did make the error of changing a setting while I was on frame 1 again. It's kind of a pain in the neck to remember that. Let's go back to our particle settings. We'll move this one up to seed 1, move this one up to seed 2. Go back to frame 1 and see if that fixes our problems. And there we go. So there's a little bit of a variance now in the way that some of these particles are moving. Let's go back to our settings here for the field, see if we can change them a little bit more. Let's turn the noise up to 10. Strength to, let's turn that back up to 2 again, because we decreased our flow. So here we go. That's a little better. Now let's make it so that our distortion field is a little bit more dynamic. We're going to go back to the first frame. Then we're going to take our distortion field and we're going to move it through space. So I'll move it over here to the front of our view, and we'll insert a keyframe for location. Then we'll go to the end of the animation. We'll move it way to the back. We'll insert another location keyframe. Open up the graph editor. We'll click on V, hit V on your keyboard, and then select vector to make it a straight move without an F curve. And then we'll go back to the first frame. Go back to our camera view and see how this alters the animation. So that looks pretty good. That's not bad at all. I kind of like what I'm seeing here. let's render this out. So we have white particles, and we're going to give a world background that is black. And then we'll go to the sidebar here, and we'll open up our display settings, turn on only render and world background. So this is our final output that we're going to get. And let's deal with our render output settings. So for the render output, if we render a frame now at 50% high definition, so using our OpenGL button here, we'll render one frame, see what we get here. That's not bad. There's a little bit of pixelization going on in there. We're going to actually blur this quite a bit later on. So with the interest of rendering at a high rate of speed, we'll leave it at 50%. Go back to the 3D view, and we're going to take this render, set it for an output, AVI JPEG. We'll just render this to the desktop. Call it Snow A. Accept, and then we'll render this out. So in real time, we'll just kind of watch this render through. You can see this render is extremely fast because they're virtual items. These are just particles. There's actually no geometry in the scene anywhere. And there we have it. So that's pretty much all we're going to do in terms of rendering from the scene. Let's go to the video sequence editor. So we're in the video sequence editor. We're going to turn on a properties panel here so we can change our output later on. We'll add our movie. So we'll go to the desktop, grab our Snow A, and we can see what it looks like. Play. What we want to do is we want to add some variation to this, a little bit of depth. So we're going to increase the number of particles, and we're going to add an effect that kind of simulates a little bit of depth and depth of field here. So we're going to take our original, and then we're going to add an effect strip that is a transform effect strip. And on the transform effect strip, we're going to go to the scale settings. We're going to click on uniform scale, and we'll set this up to 2. So it's twice as large. And then we're going to use some of the offset tools here. So we can change the position, or we can use the offset. We're going to change the position because by using the offset, it will take the image that we've actually cropped and offset that. We want to be able to get to these particles that are lying outside of the frame. So let's just move this over on the x-axis a little bit so we get a different part of the frame. You can see there's the edge. And then we'll move it up on the y-axis until we can see the bottom there. So we're just kind of taking the bottom corner of this frame here. And then let's set this to add real quick. And that doesn't work, and the reason is because we are using this image down here, and it automatically mutes that. So let's take both of these, and we will move them up. Hit G, Y, move them up. We'll take our bottom layer, we'll duplicate it and slide it down, and then we will we'll just mute this automatically. And now we'll set this one as set to add, and you can see that we now have what appears to be much closer, faster moving particles right in the foreground. You can see what that looks like. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take these foreground particles and we're going to add an effect to these. We'll add a Gaussian blur effect. And we'll set the Gaussian blur effect to, well, we'll try 4 pixels real quick. Maybe set it up to see how far we can push it, maybe 10 pixels. 10 and 10. That's pretty good. So we'll mute the transform layer now, and we'll set the Gaussian blur layer to add. So now we've got these foreground particles that are moving through the scene. We can kind of see through them because they're blurred, and they're almost a little too blurred. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the Gaussian blur layer. We'll add an adjustment layer to that, and we'll slide this out. And we will set the, no, that won't work either. Hang on 1 second. Close that out. Let's add to that a transform layer. And then we will mute the Gaussian blur layer. We'll set the transform layer to add. And then we're going to set the multiply value to 2. Really crank it up. and see what that looks like. So that looks pretty good. So now we've got a much deeper layer of these particles. We probably should have kind of a more of an intermediate layer that's in there. We have some that are really close and then some that seem a lot more further away. So let's just take these top 3, 4, and we will make those a meta strip, and then we'll set that meta strip to add. So it preserves that. We'll slide this up on the y-axis, and then we'll duplicate our snow layer. And then on this one we will add another transform layer. We'll mute the first one. And on this transform layer we will increase the uniform scale 1.5. And then we'll use the position here to slide it over to kind of the other side here. So we'll go over to the left. We went to the right on the first one. We'll go up to the top of this one to try to get it as far away from the first transform layer that we created. And that looks good. Let's take this overlay here, move it up on the y-axis out of the way a little bit more. And we'll take the transform layer, we'll add to that a Gaussian blur effect. And we'll set this, mute this transform layer, we'll set the Gaussian blur to, let's do half of what we had before, 5. And then keeping with the practice of what we did on the top layer, we'll add another transform. We'll take this transform layer and we'll set the multiply. We'll set this to 1.5 because it's a little more dense. And then we'll set this whole thing to add. So, whoops, add. There we go. So now we've got 3 layers of particles. It's all generated from the first particle setting. So we actually have 3 times as many particles than what we had to render. We'll take this, and we'll just, to make it nice and clean, we'll make this a meta strip. And just so, oops, try that again. Make meta strip. Just so you know, you can always get into the properties of your meta strips. Once you make a meta strip, you can still get to them. If you select it and then hit tab, just like any kind of group in a nodal in a node setup, you can hit tab to get inside of the group. So we can see everything that's going on in there. We can independently change these settings or delete parts or add additional layers to change that meta strip. So meta strips are incredibly powerful in compositing in the video sequence editor. We'll move this down to keep everything lined up. And this is what we have ultimately in the end. Is this three layers of particles. And I think we may need to hit refresh sequencer. Seems like we're not seeing everything. Oh, this one's not set to add. There we go. Now we're all set. Here we go. Play, and we can see all of these particles. And this is actually a pretty good asset. That looks, pretty usable. We could use this then to composite into a scene using that needs to have snow or falling ash. This is useful then to use as a matte for a color. So for example, if we wanted to take all of this, let's render this out actually real quick. We're going to render it, we'll just render it at 50% because it's blurry anyway, doesn't need to be high resolution. So we'll render this one out as Snow B. And we'll hit animation, render this out. So while it's happening, what we can do is we can use this then as an alpha matte for color, and we can use it to use any kind of color to represent whatever these particles are. So if it's snow, we can use a color like white or a very light gray, and then use this as the alpha matte for that particle system. We could apply a curve to this to tighten up our blur a little bit and actually reduce the number of particles or the visibility of them. Or we could use a black or a dark gray color and generate what might look like some other kind of particle, maybe ash, an ash cloud, or some kind of dust. We could also, let's go back to our video sequence editor view here. And actually, let's make another scene. We'll leave the settings the way they are. We'll import our render, Snow Bee. You could also use this to generate sparks. So again, you could apply it to a color, or we could add a curve adjustment to it, like this. And we could set up a curve where the reds are higher, take the blues down a little bit, get more of an orangey color to it. And then you can set this whole layer to an add blend mode on top of other footage. So if we move this up, and let's say I add a color down here, which is black, and let's make this kind of a blue color. So you can see how this is then added to the footage, and if I hit play, you can see we have these sparks flying through the scene. So if you had less of these, you've seen this common compositing effect in movies these days, where you see, this disaster scene and sparks kind of flying through. You have no idea where the sparks are actually coming from, but they're in the scene kind of in the middle or foreground there, and you're looking through them. This is a way to do it. You could then set this into a 3D space. You can use the game engine blend modes, add a curve to it, and voila, you've got some sparks in your scene. So, easy asset creation. We didn't have to use any high-level rendering, rendered very quickly using the OpenGL properties and just very, very simple particle settings. So this is a lot easier, as I pointed out in the previous two tutorials, this is a lot easier to make an asset that you can use in a scene than it is to have a ton of geometry with particles in there as well. So this is just an easier way to kind of add an effect to your scene without increasing the system resources needed to render it. Let's get rid of these spark curves, and let's try something else. Let's take this color, and we'll move it up, and then I'll add another color below it. On the bottom color, we'll make the bottom color white, absolute white, just so this stands out. And then the top color, we'll make it black, absolute black. And the top color we're going to set to alpha over. And then we're going to take our particle layer, we're going to turn it off. And for the black layer that's set to alpha over, we'll add a mask. And for that mask, we will add our Snow Bee. So we're using the asset as a mask then to generate particles that are black. So this looks more like a dust or particles that are coming from an ash cloud or something like that. You can work on the style of the particles and the way they look in the animation and the turbulence that you have in there. But anyway, this is how it's done. Another way that we can use this, let's make another scene. And we'll go to the default view of this scene, so scene number 2. Go to the 3D view and turn off our only render. Turn on our OpenGL, GLSL mode. We'll add a camera to the scene. We will align the active camera to our view. And then we will import image as planes. You want to enable this. Our asset from the desktop, Snow Bee. And we'll rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees. Now I could have set in there the shading to shadeless, which is what you want to do. And because we're in a GLSL, I did see a recent tutorial not long ago. I'll pick on a 3-point edit out there, Dave McSween. I saw that you had a tutorial where you were talking about using a video from the Viewport inside of the VSE. If you're watching this, and you were pointing out that you have to click on, I can't remember what you clicked on, you had to click on the texture to watch your video playback. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is turn on the GLSL shading mode. So if you have GLSL shading mode on, videos will automatically play back. It doesn't matter what you have selected. You can always, oops, sorry about that. We're set to the Wrong scene. There you go. So you can see it doesn't matter what I select, I can see that video play back. So anyway, quick little tip there. GLSL is useful for a lot more than just rendering in OpenGL in the game engine settings. It also allows you to see animations. If I go back to multi-texture, see it doesn't play. If I go to GLSL, it plays. Okay. We could take this and then we could set it as a mat for itself to create particles. So the way we do that is we have to enable the nodes for this. So for this material, we're going to use nodes. Open up the node editor. And in the node editor, we can select our material, which was Snow Bee. And now it comes back, you can see it there. And instead of having this in the material setting, I'm going to put it into the alpha. And the color that's on here is black. So if I go back to the camera, what it's using is it's using the actual imagery, the white, as an alpha channel for black. So I'm kind of emulating the same thing that I had before, only this time, if I scale this up, if I could make different versions of this, move this one back in Y space here, and we'll slide it over a little bit, move it down, and then we'll do another one, and move it back in Y space again, and I slide it over here, and we'll move this one up. So they're kind of offset from each other. And we go back to the camera view. I've got now 3D perspective of my particle system in here. And actually, let's set this up so it looks like snow. We'll select the first one. We'll change this to white. And close this. Whoops. Close this down now. And we'll add a background. We'll make the background black so we can see this really easily. And we'll set this to only render. So now I'm looking through, because I generated these from foreground to background, my draw order is set up properly. Now look what I can do with my camera. I can move, wait till the cycles around to the beginning here. I can move through Y space through this like I'm in a three-dimensional environment. See how that works? So I've got these 3 layers of particles now that are actually three-dimensional. So I could create an animation in which I'm moving through particles using my camera, making a camera move. So a lot of ways that you can use this. I could even try to follow some of these particles down. Actually, if I go up, move this up on the Z-axis. See, you can actually see it a little better that it's not animating. You can see how I'm moving through this. That's actually a pretty good freeze frame effect, right? I could have my particles moving and then my animation stops, but my camera can move through the particles like this. I can render that out. And again, it renders in OpenGL, and you can get everything in there. So this is how you can use these, simple assets. I've got now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have 9 times the number of particles that I actually had to render inside of the scene. I didn't really have to add any more geometry to it. I just had to render it out and then reuse it. So anyway, that's your tutorial for quick assets for today, creating a kind of a snow effect. If you wanted to create a rain effect, you could do the same kind of thing, and just not use the so much of the distortion, the turbulence in there. Have it fall in more, unidirectional. But anyway, there you go. Particles without having to use particles inside of a scene. There you go. I hope you find this useful, and I wish all of you happy blending.